The proposal in San Francisco has reignited the debate over reparations for Black Americans. The city's Reparations Advisory Committee has recommended that qualifying Black residents should receive $5 million each. According to the committee, the suggested amount is not a direct recompense for slavery, but rather serves as an investment in a community harmed by centuries of discriminatory practices. The proposal comes as cities and states across the country grapple with the question of reparations. But some advocates and experts are wary of the San Francisco proposal, including my next guest, who told the Washington Post, quote, "Calling for $5 million payout by a local government undercuts the credibility of the reparations effort." And joining me now is William A. Darity Jr., the Samuel Dubois Cook Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke University. He's considered a leading scholar on the economics of racial inequality. Dr. Darity, thank you very much for coming to the Saturday show. So please explain further. Why do you think San Francisco's $5 million proposal is excessive?
I think it's really critical in determining what the amount of a reparations bill should be, that we have a very careful foundation for calculating that sum. And I don't believe that there's been any serious explanation as to how the San Francisco task force came up with that number, that figure. And of course, when people hear that figure, it sounds extraordinarily large. It might be a legitimate figure if there was a legitimate basis for calculating it. It's not consistent with the ways in which Kirsten Mullen and I have attempted to calculate it in the work that we've done in our book, From Here to Equality.
And I want to talk about that in a minute. Just to point out, in the Washington Post story, it does make a point of saying that the final recommendations and report won't come out until June. But as you say, that $5 million figure has caught a lot of people's attention. So let's talk about your work, particularly your book that you just mentioned. As I said, you told the Washington Post, Black Americans should receive at least $350,000 each in federal reparations. So how did you come up with that number, and how would that work?
So in the work that we've done, we have argued that the racial wealth gap in the United States, the disparity in the amount of the net value of property that is held by Black and white Americans, that should constitute the most effective economic indicator of the cumulative intergenerational effects of racism for living descendants of persons who were enslaved in the United States. And that amount, based upon Federal Reserve data, comes to approximately $840,000 per household, which translates into approximately $350,000 per person. And we argue that that's the best way to try to calculate what the amount of a reparations plan should be. If you were to total that figure up across 40 million eligible Black Americans, it would amount to approximately $14 trillion.
$14 trillion, at $350,000 roughly per person. And you mentioned that we should go about it through closing the racial wealth gap. What do you say to folks who say, well, maybe $350,000 cash to people isn't the way to go. Maybe we should do other things like free college tuition or housing, changes in housing policy, changes in tax policy. Is that a way to go about reparations?
Well, it's difficult to address each of these one by one, but let me take the educational voucher argument first. Certainly, I would love to see a world in which all Americans had the opportunity to access education at low or no cost, but that's not going to address the racial wealth gap. And in fact, one of the most striking things about the data that we've accumulated over the years is the finding that individuals who are Black, who are heads of households with a college degree, have 2/3 of the net worth or wealth of individuals who are white, who have never finished high school. So closing the educational gap will not close the wealth gap. And I would argue that the other kinds of tactics that people have described will not do so either. Indirect measures are not going to be effective. You have to make a direct transfer of resources from the federal government to individual Black Americans to close the gap.
You know, I am glad you brought up that study, because I remember when it came out and there was a news story about it, and I read it and thought, wow, you know, no matter what you do, no matter how hard you work, how many degrees you get, because my mother kept saying, you know, get all the degrees you can.
So did mine.
Yes. Well, and I didn't go as far as you did, because you got a doctorate from MIT. So you got all the paper, and yet to come to find out that even with all those documents that you have, all those the pedigree that you have, by and large, you know, we make less than a white person without.
The major consideration here is the fact that the way in which people accumulate wealth is largely driven by the resources that they can obtain from their parents and their grandparents. Mm-hmm. So it's what we call technically intergenerational transmission effects. Mm-hmm. And if you have a community, say Black Americans, who have been deprived of the opportunity to accumulate wealth in past generations, then those transfers don't occur. And we can talk about the range of historical factors that come into play in preventing Black Americans from accumulating wealth to the same degree as white Americans. I'd like to highlight one set of policies in the late 19th century when, in the aftermath of slavery, Black Americans who had been emancipated were promised 40-acre land grants as restitution for their years of bondage. That promise was not kept. On the other hand, 1.5 million white families in the United States, approximately 10 to 12% of the white population, received 160-acre land grants in the Western Territories under the Homestead Act of 1862. And Trina Shanks Williams, a scholar at the University of Michigan, now estimates that at least 45 million living white Americans are beneficiaries of those land grants that were given primarily during the end of the 19th century.
Dr. Darity, we're out of time, but I got to squeeze in two more questions. Attorney Leo Terrell, a Fox News contributor, called the proposal out of San Francisco, quote, outrageous, unlawful, unconstitutional, and racist. Has the San Francisco committee given critics of reparations ammunition to undercut the argument for it?
Yeah, I think unfortunately they have, and it's unfortunate that they issued that report so early. On the other hand, the principle of reparations that animates their work is entirely valid.
And Dr. Darity, last question. What was the name of that book? What's the name of your book?
It's called From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century.